Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a special screencast-o-matic recording. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the amendments numbers 11 through 27. Essentially, this is the greater Constitution, other parts outside of the Bill of Rights. For this particular lesson, we're going to be examining not only the amendments themselves, but also explaining the contextual backgrounds of politics and government and society that brought about the addition or addendum or amendment process for these particular provisions to be enacted into law. So before I begin, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson to the part of the Google Doc that has this particular part in it. Please remember to fill in any key content and or answer any key concept questions that appear. Let's get started. So an overview. There are 17 other amendments not included in the Bill of Rights. The rest of the amendments have been added from 1795 to 1992. That's a long time. The most important of these amendments basically deal with civil rights issues and voting, and expanding the democratic process for citizens across the land. So please listen closely, because these are all the amendments numbers 11 through 27. The 11th Amendment. Enacted in 1795, the 11th Amendment deals with lawsuits against states. For example, federal courts are not to be used when a citizen of another state sues the state. They must use state court systems directly. Another example of this provision is that foreign countries cannot sue a state in federal court. Like Norway suing the state of Delaware in the Supreme Court, this cannot happen. You'll understand this, I think, a little bit better when we get to the judicial branch unit and talk about our court system, as elaborate as it is, and focusing on some of the issues that might go through certain courts in this way. The 12th Amendment was enacted in 1804, and this deals with the president and vice president being elected together as a package deal. You see, this kept them from being from two different parties and arguing constantly. I don't know if you guys know this, but the way that democracy used to work as far as presidential elections are concerned is that the president would be the person with the highest number of votes and the vice president would be the person with the second highest number of votes. And just so you know, this also states that the House of Representatives picks, if there is a tie, who the winner is. The 13th Amendment is really important in that it abolished slavery in the United States, and it also abolished involuntary servitude. Enacted in 1865, right after the American Civil War, this ended slavery and slavery as a result of debt. Essentially, this provision gave Congress the right to make laws to enforce this and to oversee it fully. Now, there's an exception to this, just so you know, prisoners doing manual labor as part of their sentence is still allowed. In fact, our criminal justice system essentially carries forth this process. However, please understand that this amendment guaranteed slaves freedom, but not necessarily any and all rights. We'll get to more of that later. The 14th Amendment, enacted in 1868, gave and explained the rights of citizens fully. Basically, this gave people born or naturalized in the United States citizenship and the rights that come along with it. Naturalization, if you remember, was something we talked about in the first mini-unit of this year, and naturalized citizens essentially becoming part of the American citizenship process allows them to conform to our laws and standards and take up our rights and privileges too. The 15th Amendment essentially deals with the right to vote. Enacted in 1870, this gave citizens the right to vote, and they could not be denied based on race, color, or if they were formerly a slave. Essentially, this provision gave Congress the power to enforce it fully. Grandfather laws, poll taxes, and voter tests, however, were still allowed in some parts of the United States, including the southern part of the United States. Please note that this amendment did not give women the right to vote. In fact, that amendment or provision will be coming later. The 16th and 17th Amendments. The 16th Amendment granted Congress the power to tax income. If you've ever heard of income tax, yep, this is the amendment that deals with that. Enacted in 1913, this provision was done or enacted to help pay for government expenses. If you remember the beginning part of this year, we talked about the importance of taxes in our government and in our democracy to pay for some of the things that we might take for granted. Then came the 17th Amendment, enacted in 1913 as well. This provides the election of senators directly by the people. You guys may not know this, but we used to vote for senators through the state legislature. But now citizens directly vote and cast ballots for our senators. Pennsylvania, for example, has 2 senators, and we vote for them directly through our democratic process of voting. The 18th Amendment is a rather interesting one because it set up prohibition. If you remember learning about this from American cultures too, this will sound incredibly familiar. This essentially banned the sale, production, and consumption of alcohol, and this is the only amendment in the entire U.S. Constitution to be repealed. The 21st Amendment would take care of that. This provision was abandoned due to an increase of high organized crime. If you remember learning about, of course, Al Capone and Bugs Moran and some of the iconic American gangsters for the time, whole cities were engulfed in a halcyon of crime. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, or gave them suffrage. This was enacted in 1920, and one of the main reasons many historians note was that during World War I, women were a key part of the workforce working in factories and weren't able to vote. And so the hypocrisy for the time that we would call on them to help us out, but they wouldn't get the right to vote, was somewhat glaring. So due to, of course, not only that, but other mounting social and cultural pressures, and with, of course, suffrage efforts from people like Susan B. Anthony and so on and so forth, you would understand the essence that this was a long time coming. The 20th Amendment changes the beginning dates for presidential and congressional terms. This was enacted in 1933. You guys may not know this, but this was done as a result of travel being better and faster with technology and science, and of course with getting people to start their terms quicker once they actually got to Washington, D.C. The 21st Amendment essentially repealed Prohibition fully. This happened in 1933 as well. Prohibition only lasted for 14 years total, and many cite the 18th Amendment as being a total and utter failure. Please be advised, however, that because the 18th Amendment is essentially null and void, it cannot just simply be erased from the Constitution. It's still there, it just doesn't really have any type of pulling or executive power. The 22nd Amendment placed a limit on the number of terms a president can serve, and this was enacted in 1951. Essentially, this was done as a result of Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected to 4 consecutive terms and dying in his 4th term. Although many people thought that his election at the time was necessary for the continuity of the country and finishing World War II, the fact is that every other president before FDR stepped down after 2 consecutive terms out of tradition and respect for moving democracy forward. So this provision essentially put that in place. The 23rd Amendment granted residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections. In 1961, this was enacted. You see, Washington, D.C. is not actually a state, and therefore people cannot directly vote. But now also, Washington, D.C. has electoral votes that they cast or gets cast in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment was later passed in 1964, which prohibited poll taxes. This was a tax required to vote, and predominantly, of course, in the South. Many people called this a voter suppression type of measure, and this outlawed as a method for trying to prevent blacks from voting specifically. Most blacks are below the poverty line, so of course it was pretty ridiculous the fact that we were charging people to simply exercise their democratic right to vote. The 25th Amendment set policies for presidential line of succession in case the president is incapacitated, and this was done in 1967. Basically, the vice president takes over and then nominates his new vice president accordingly. This puts the vice president in charge if the president is in surgery, of course incapacitated due to a disease or any type of illness. If you recall, the type of line of succession that we have is in fact helpful, and it's been used a few times for sure. In other countries, when there's not a clear line of succession, this is incredibly hard on the government and the people alike. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, and this was enacted in 1971. Most people believe this was done as a result of the Vietnam War. Because of 18-year-olds being able to become drafted to serve and fight, they were unable to vote, and many people thought that this was absolutely ridiculous. Many people, in fact, chanted if they're old enough to fight, they should be old enough to vote. And in a sense, now more young people made up the voting demographic. And then came the 27th Amendment, which placed limits on congressional pay raises. This was enacted in 1992. Congress basically can raise its pay, but it cannot go into effect until the following term begins. Congress has terms just like a president has terms. So for example, even though we vote for a new president in November once every 4 years, their terms don't essentially start until they're inaugurated later in January. The same thing could essentially be said to be true for members of Congress as well. There is that layover period. So as you guys can see, those are all the amendments 11 through 27. I think it's really important for you not only to know them as a civics and government student, but also moreover as a citizen of this country. Once again, it's really important to know the contours and outlines of your rights, and becoming a citizenship savvy citizen allows you the chance to not only know these rights, but of course exercise them accordingly. So I hope you found this to be incredibly helpful. Remember, you can replay any part of this presentation that you might need for detail, help, or clarity.